They told her she was too much, too wide, too soft, too stubborn to ever be loved. Her own family handed her a one-way ticket to the edge of nowhere and called it kindness. So Hannah Carter built a life from scratch, calloused hands, bleeding knuckles, and 60 beehives humming in the pines. Then one night the sky split open, and out of the freezing dark walked a man who had been watching her all along, not to take anything, but because he had never seen anything so worth protecting. Drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, and stay until the very last word, because this is the story of a woman who was told she was worthless, and the quiet mountain man who showed the whole world just how wrong they were. The territory of Pine Ridge sat at the far end of a long dirt road that most people only found by accident, and left just as quickly once they understood what kind of country it truly was. The mountains here did not perform their beauty for anyone. They simply stood, ancient, indifferent, snow-capped, even in the shoulder seasons, and they demanded the same honesty from anyone who chose to live beneath their shadow. There were no grand parlors in Pine Ridge, no gas-lit boulevards, no society pages recording who wore what at whose dinner party. There was only the land and the weather, and the quiet, relentless work of survival. Most people found that intolerable. Hannah Carter found it the closest thing to peace she had ever known. She had arrived 2 years prior in the raw, muddy chaos of early April, driving a borrowed wagon loaded with everything she owned in the world. That was not very much, a trunk of serviceable clothing, nothing fashionable, nothing with lace trim or whalebone structure, because those garments had never been made with a woman of her stature in mind, and even if they had, she had long since stopped caring. A crate of books dog-eared and rain-warped from a life spent reading by inadequate lamplight. A cast-iron skillet, a good knife, a tin coffee pot, and a small wooden box carefully cushioned in old flannel containing 6 queen bee cells packed in comb wax, the beginning of everything. The land itself had cost her nearly all of the modest inheritance left to her by her father's unmarried sister, a woman Hannah had met only twice, but who had apparently recognized something in her niece worth leaving a legacy to. It was not much of a legacy by the standards of the world Hannah had grown up in. A sum that would have barely covered 1 season of her sister Cecilia's dress allowance. But it was enough to purchase 12 acres of rocky, pine-forested slope at the northern edge of Pine Ridge Township, with a small creek running through the low meadow and a tumble-down one-room cabin that had last been occupied sometime before the war. She had repaired that cabin herself. She wanted that clearly understood because there were those in Pine Ridge who had doubted she could. Old Mr. Whitmore at the general store had watched her load timber into her wagon with an expression that sat somewhere between admiration and pity, and he had said with the particular brand of well-meaning condescension that small communities bestow upon solitary women, "Miss Carter, if you need a hand with any of that heavy lifting, you just say the word." He had expected her to say the word immediately, or at least within the week. She had not said it at all. She had gone home, and she had set the new corner posts herself, mixed the daubing herself, replaced the rotted window frames herself, and climbed up onto the roof in the cold May wind, and replaced every third shingle herself. By summer the cabin was sound. By fall her first hives were established in the low meadow, and the bees had found the wildflower fields that rolled away to the east like a rumpled quilt stitched in purple clover and goldenrod and pale mountain aster. The honey they produced in that first season was extraordinary. Hannah had known it would be. She had been keeping bees since she was 12 years old, when she had found a swarm in the hollow apple tree at the back edge of her father's estate, and had walked right up to it while her sisters screamed and ran. She had never been afraid of bees. She understood them in a way she had never quite managed to understand people. Bees were organized. They were purposeful. They operated according to laws that were ancient and reliable, and they did not care in the slightest whether you were slender or broad fashionable or plain spoken for or alone. They only cared whether you were calm, whether your hands were steady, whether you came to them with intention and patience rather than fear and grasping. By those measures, Hannah Carter was perfect. She had not always known that about herself. There had been a long period in her life, a period that encompassed with depressing thoroughness most of her childhood and all of her young womanhood, during which she had understood herself primarily through the lens of everything she was not. She was not delicate. She was not willowy. She was not the kind of woman who could wear the current fashions without a dressmaker's significant intervention, and even then the intervention rarely produced what society considered a satisfying result. She was powerfully built, broad-shouldered, and full-figured, with strong hands and a tendency to take up whatever space her body naturally required without any particular architectural apology. In another era, in another kind of world, this might simply have been called being a woman of substance. In the drawing rooms of the Carter family's social circle, it was called a problem. Her mother, Virginia Carter, had spent 12 years attempting to solve that problem through a combination of restrictive garments, strategic seating arrangements, and what she described as gentle encouragement, but what Hannah had experienced as a relentless low-grade erosion of any confidence she might have briefly developed. Virginia Carter was a beautiful woman in the narrow porcelain way that society valued most thin to the point of fragility, with the kind of fine bone structure that men in dining clubs described as refined and women in parlors described as impeccable. She had produced 2 daughters who had inherited her frame. Cecilia, the eldest, was a perfect replica and had married a tobacco merchant with considerable holdings before her 20th birthday. Louisa, the middle daughter, was slightly more substantial, but still fell within the acceptable range, and had secured a respectable match with a junior solicitor. And then there was Hannah, youngest and, in Virginia, Carter's private taxonomy, most troublesome, not because Hannah was unkind or unintelligent or even particularly difficult in her temperament. She was, in fact, notably easy-going, deeply patient, and possessed of a practical competence that should, in a just world, have made her extraordinarily marriageable. She could manage a household budget, preserve an entire season's harvest tent, any animal that came under her care, and keep accounts with a precision that would have made a bank clerk weep with relief. But these were not the qualities being assessed in the drawing rooms where Hannah was presented season after season to a parade of men who looked at her once briefly and then found reasons to direct their attention elsewhere. The assessments were rarely delivered to her face. That was one of the particular cruelties of her situation. They arrived instead as atmospheric pressure, a cooling of the room when she entered, a subtle reorganization of the conversation to exclude her, a pattern of invitations that dried up after the first visit. She overheard things occasionally in the way that women who have been taught to make themselves invisible often end up hearing more than was intended. A remark at a garden party delivered in what its speaker had apparently believed was a private aside about whether Virginia Carter had considered being more realistic in her expectations for her youngest. A comment at a supper table half muffled by a wine glass about how it was rather a shame about the figure because the face was quite pleasant. A conversation between her mother and her aunt conducted in the next room with the door only 3/4 closed, in which her mother had described her in a voice tight with frustrated affection as a dear girl, but such a difficult proposition. A difficult proposition. She had been 17 years old when she overheard that particular phrase. She had gone upstairs, closed her bedroom door quietly behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed for a very long time, turning the words over in her mind, the way you might turn a stone over to examine what lived under it. A difficult proposition, as though her existence were a business arrangement that was not coming together satisfactorily, as though the problem of her were primarily a logistical one, a puzzle of placement and presentation, rather than a matter of a human being with an interior life and dishes, and the entirely reasonable expectation of being met with simple human decency. She had not wept. Even then, at 17, she had not been much given to weeping over things that could not be changed. She had instead developed over the following years a comprehensive and efficient emotional architecture designed to keep the worst of the damage at bay. She worked. She occupied herself so thoroughly with practical tasks, the kitchens, the gardens, the household accounts, later the beehives, that there was rarely sufficient empty time in her days for the cold, familiar ache to settle in properly. She did not attend social events unless absolutely required. She did not attempt the fashionable garments any more. She wore good, solid, well-made clothing in colors that suited her, and fabrics that could bear genuine work, and if anyone found this a subject worth commenting on, she was by her mid-20s sufficiently armored to let the comment roll off her, like water off oiled leather. But armor, however well constructed, is not the same as healing. Hannah Carter was armored. She was not healed. And the difference lived in the small, unguarded moments, in the way she instinctively turned sideways when walking through narrow doorways, even when there was no need to, in the way she always took the least prominent chair at any table. In the way she apologized reflexively whenever she required any form of assistance, as though the mere fact of her needing something from another person was an imposition she was obligated to preemptively atone for. The departure from her family's home had been depending upon whose account you accepted, either a mutual decision or an expulsion. Hannah's account, which was the only one she gave any weight to, was that by the time she was 28, it had become clear to all parties that her continued presence in the family household served primarily as a social liability and a quiet, persistent reminder of a problem that could not be resolved. Her brother-in-law, Cecilia's husband, a man named Gerald Whitfield, had been particularly direct about this. Gerald Whitfield was the kind of man who dressed expensively and spoke with the confidence of someone who had never once been told that his opinion was not required. He had married Cecilia for the social connections the Carter name still carried, despite its diminishing finances, and he had immediately and efficiently begun to regard everything associated with the Carter family as either an asset or a liability, assigning each component its category and treating it accordingly. Hannah, in Gerald Whitfield's accounting, was firmly in the liability column. He had not said so to her directly, not at first. It had started as suggestions delivered through Cecilia as an intermediary that perhaps Hannah might be more comfortable in a smaller room, as the guest suite was frequently needed for more pressing engagements. That perhaps Hannah's beehives, which she had established in the back garden with permission she had believed was genuine, were drawing unwanted attention from neighbors. That perhaps in general Hannah might consider whether she was making the best use of her opportunities, a phrase whose meaning she understood perfectly well, which was that she was expected to find somewhere else to be as soon as possible. The inheritance from her great-aunt had arrived at a moment that Hannah had later come to think of as a grace. Not the grace of religious ecstasy or divine intervention, but the quieter, more practical grace of a door appearing in a wall precisely when the rooms on the other side have become uninhabitable. She had taken the money, inquired through a land agent about available properties in the territories that were distant enough to represent a genuine new beginning, and within 6 months had loaded her wagon and pointed the horses north and west. Cecilia had cried briefly and prettily at the departure in the way of someone who had genuinely cared, in a shallow way, and was not entirely without feeling, but was also relieved. Their mother had pressed Hannah's hand and said, "I do hope you know what you're doing, dear," in a tone that made clear she believed the answer was no. Gerald Whitfield had been conspicuously absent from the farewell, which Hannah had counted as a mercy. She had not looked back. She had driven out through the gates with her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the road ahead and the small wooden box of queen bee cells tucked safely beside her on the wagon bench. And she had told herself, and she had believed it, which mattered enormously, that whatever came next would be built by her own hands and would belong to no one's assessment but her own. That had been 2 years ago. Now it was late October in Pine Ridge, and Hannah Carter's apiary stood in the lower meadow as the finest thing she had ever made. 60 hives painted in the creamy white she had mixed herself from a formula she had read in a German beekeeper's manual, arranged in neat rows on the wooden stand she had constructed herself across 3 autumn weekends. The bees had been exceptional this past season. The wildflower bloom had been extraordinary weeks of warm, unhurried days following good spring rain. And the honey the bees had laid down in those golden frames was unlike anything Hannah had extracted before. Deep amber, nearly mahogany, at the center of the comb, with a flavor that carried notes of mountain clover and late-season goldenrod, and something she had no name for, something that tasted like the particular quality of light in this valley in the late afternoon of a September day. She had taken a jar of it to the general store, and Mr. Whitmore had tasted it and gone very quiet in the way of a man who is genuinely moved by something, and then he had told her without any hedging or condescension that he would take every jar she could spare, and that he believed he could fetch a price considerably above what she had been hoping. She had walked home from that conversation in the amber October light with something cautious and unfamiliar warming in her chest. Not happiness exactly. She was wary of that word, had learned to keep it at a careful distance, but something in the neighborhood of satisfaction which she had decided was more trustworthy anyway. The bees had responded to her. The land had responded to her. The work she had put her hands and her back and her stubbornly persistent hope into had produced something real and valuable, and no one in the world could take that accounting from her. She had gone out to the apiary that evening and walked slowly between the hives in the cooling air, listening to the deep, comfortable hum of 50,000 bees settling toward winter in their painted white homes. And she had allowed herself for a few minutes to simply feel the fierce, quiet pride of it. What she did not know, standing there in the fading gold of that October evening, was that she had been observed, that at the edge of the pine tree line, where the meadow met the shadow of the old forest, in a ragged dark margin of scrub and standing deadwood, there were eyes on her. Not predatory eyes, not hungry eyes in the way she had been taught to fear. Simply watchful ones, steady and patient, and carrying, without her knowledge or consent, something very close to reverence. Ezekiel Hayes had first seen her in early summer from a distance of perhaps 300 yards, when she had been working the extraction line in her backyard, the long, methodical process of uncapping and spinning the honey frames that occupied her for most of 2 days each harvest cycle. He had come down from the upper ridges to check the old trap line he maintained in the eastern forest, a route that crossed the northern edge of her property at the creek, and he had stopped at the tree line and watched her work for nearly 20 minutes before some combination of conscience and uncertainty had sent him quietly back into the pines. He had not meant to become a watcher. It was not something he had planned. But the trap line crossed her land, and she was always there, and she was always working with a quality of focus and physical intention that he found himself returning to observe the way you might return to watch a river after a strong rain. Not because the river was performing anything, but because there was something true and unhurried about its motion that settled something unsettled in your chest. Ezekiel Hayes was 36 years old and had been living alone in the Upper Ridge country for going on 4 years since the end of certain events he did not discuss and rarely thought about, directly preferring to think around them the way the tongue moves around a broken tooth. He had been a soldier before that, and before that a surveyor's assistant in the mountain territories, and before that, in the earliest, most distant chapter of his life, a boy in a small river town who had grown up in a house full of noise and had learned very young that silence was frequently an undervalued resource. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, and carried a quietness about him that was not coldness. The distinction mattered, though most people did not bother to make it. He simply had no appetite for unnecessary speech. He communicated in actions, in presence, in the quality of his attention, and people who understood that kind of language generally understood him very well. People who did not tend to find him unsettling, which was fine by him. He had watched Hannah Carter throughout the summer with a respect that he recognized as something more than ordinary, though he had not interrogated it too closely. She was in his observation the most genuinely hard-working person he had encountered in 4 years of mountain living, which was saying a considerable amount, given that he had known some very hard-working people up here. But it was not only the physical labor that held his attention. It was the quality of her presence among the bees, the way she moved through them with a deep, unhurried calm, as though she had reached some private agreement with the natural world that it was not necessary to explain to anyone else. There was no performance in it, no awareness of an audience. She worked with the pure, concentrated energy of someone who has found the exact thing they were made to do and is doing it in the exact place they were made to do it, and Ezekiel Hayes, who understood something about the rarity of that condition, found it quietly extraordinary. He had not introduced himself. He was not sure honestly what he would have said. He was not a man who introduced himself for the sake of social convention, and he did not think she would have appreciated the revelation that she had been observed without her knowledge, however respectfully. So he had continued to tend his trapline, and she had continued to tend her hives, and the fact of his watching had remained his own private thing, carrying no weight in her life until the night the storm came down off the mountains and changed everything. The sky had begun shifting 3 days before in the way of serious weather, a peculiar quality to the light, a heaviness in the air that settled into your joints, if you were paying attention, a change in the way the pines moved that was less like wind and more like warning. Hannah had noticed it on the Monday. She had spent Tuesday reinforcing the hive straps and checking the ventilation in each of the 60 boxes. And she had stood in the meadow Wednesday morning looking at the sky to the northwest and felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature moving through her. This was not an ordinary autumn squall. This was something that had come a long way to get here, and it was not going to be gentle about its arrival. She had done everything she could in the hours before it hit. She had moved what supplies she could into the cabin. She had reinforced the hive stands with additional timber bracing. She had laid extra strapping across the topmost boxes of each hive, tying them down with the strongest rope she owned. She had checked the creek levels and satisfied herself that the meadow was unlikely to flood. And then, as the first hard fingers of wind began to come down through the pass above and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, she had realized that what she had done was not going to be enough. The storm arrived after dark with a violence that was almost personal in its intensity. Not rain at first, but ice, a horizontal driving sleet that hit the windows of the cabin like thrown gravel and coated everything it touched with a thin, treacherous glaze within minutes. The wind came behind the ice, and it was not the usual mountain wind that pushed and howled and passed. It was a sustained, grinding force that leaned against the walls of the cabin with patient, enormous weight, and in the lower meadow Hannah could hear, even from inside, even over the roar of it, the sounds of wood under stress, the crack and shift of things being pushed past their tolerances. She had stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, feeling the ice hit her face, and she had known with absolute certainty that if she did not go out there, she would lose hives tonight, possibly many of them. She had not hesitated. She had pulled on her heaviest coat, wound her thickest scarf around her face, pulled her boots on over 2 pairs of stockings, taken up her lantern and a length of rope, and gone out into the teeth of it. The meadow in the storm was a different world. The ice had coated every surface in a shining, treacherous layer that made every step a negotiation with disaster. The lantern flame fought the wind with a desperation she recognized as kin to her own, and she had held it up against the darkness and moved down the slope toward the hives with careful, deliberate steps, testing each footfall before committing her weight, the rope in her other hand for when she reached the hive stands and needed something to hold. 3 hives had already toppled, blown from their stands by the wind, the wooden boxes cracked open on the frozen ground, the frames scattering across the ice. She had set her lantern down in the partial shelter of the nearest standing hive, and had gone to work on her knees in the freezing mud and ice, gathering frames, writing boxes, using her body as a windbreak where there was nothing else. The cold was extraordinary. It went through her coat in the first 10 minutes and then began working on her from the inside in a way that she recognized distantly as dangerous, but which she could not afford to attend to yet. There was too much to do. Her hands had stopped hurting by the time she reached the 5th overturned hive, which she understood was not a good sign, but she was lifting the heavy wooden box back onto its stand with the full force of her shoulders and her back, and was not in a position to be overly concerned with warning signs. The rope was cutting into her palms. She could see blood on her left hand where the edge of a broken frame had caught her a dark thread in the lantern light that the cold and the rain were already washing pale. She wiped it against her coat and kept moving. She did not hear him coming. The storm was too loud, and she was too focused, and there was no warning at all, only a sudden enormous calm that materialized at her back, a mass of warmth and solidity between her and the driving wind. And then 2 large hands, gloved in heavy leather, came past her, and took hold of the hive box she was struggling with, and simply lifted it onto the stand with a steadiness that made her effort look like it had been a mistake, rather than an act of considerable strength. She spun around with her heart in her throat, and found herself looking up at a man she did not know, tall and heavily built and shadowed by the brim of a hat that the wind was making every effort to remove. And she opened her mouth to say something, she was not sure what, something between a question and a warning, and he looked at her briefly and very directly in the way of a man assessing a situation rather than a person, and said in a voice that was low enough to carry under the wind, rather than over it, "How many more are down?" She was too surprised to do anything other than answer him honestly. 7 that I can see, she said, maybe more on the east row. He nodded once, already moving toward the east row, and she turned back to her own work with the extraordinary, disorienting sensation of having a second pair of hands in a crisis, something she had not experienced in 2 years and had stopped expecting. They worked in parallel for the better part of an hour in the howling dark, not speaking, not needing to, moving with the efficient wordlessness of 2 people who are paying close attention to the same problem. Hannah worked the west row, and he worked the east. And when they met in the middle, there were 47 hives standing and braced, and the remaining 13 were beyond saving, that night open boxes, scattered frames, comb destroyed by the ice, and Hannah stood looking at those 13 with her jaw set, and her hand still, and something enormous and cold moving through her that was not the weather. She realized, standing there, that she was shaking. Not from grief, or not only from grief, from the cold, from 2 hours in the driving sleet, without adequate shelter, her coat soaked through, and her body running out of the reserves it had been spending to keep her moving. The shaking started in her hands and moved up through her arms and into her torso in long, uncontrollable waves, and she braced her feet and pressed her jaw together and refused to acknowledge it, because there was still work to do, because there were 13 hives worth of frames to account for, because she had not come out here to fail. The man was beside her again. She had not tracked his approach. He was simply there, as he had been throughout the storm, materializing with a quietness that had nothing stealthy about it, only attentive. He looked at her for a moment with those steady, assessing eyes, and then he did not ask permission and did not announce his intention. He simply bent slightly, placed one arm behind her knees and one arm across her back, and lifted her against his chest in a single, unhurried motion, as though she were something worth being careful with, and began walking toward the tree line. She made a sound that was approximately an objection. "The hives," she said against his coat, her voice coming out thinner than she intended, because her jaw was still shaking. "They'll be there in the morning," he said. She wanted to argue. She had a number of arguments available, organized and ready for deployment. But the warmth of him was extraordinary, a solid wall of it against the frozen front of her body, and the shaking was getting worse rather than better, and somewhere under the arguments was a body that was running very low on everything it needed and was not. If she was honest in any position to override a person who was carrying her toward shelter with a gentleness that suggested she was not inconveniencing him in the slightest. She said nothing more. She let her head drop against his shoulder, and she closed her eyes against the driving sleet, and she let him carry her into the dark of the pines, toward the glow of a light she had not known was there. The cabin materialized out of the dark and the driving sleet like something that had always been there and simply chosen this moment to reveal itself. It sat back in the pines perhaps a quarter mile from the meadow's northern edge, built low and solid against the hillside, the way a man builds when he has learned to respect the weather rather than challenge it. No decorative trim, no porch railing, no concession to appearance over function. Just heavy timber walls, chinked tight against the wind, a stone chimney exhaling a thick column of smoke that the storm immediately tore apart and scattered, and a single window with amber light pressing against the frost on its glass like a hand pressing against a cold door. Ezekiel carried her up the short rise to the door without adjusting his grip or breaking his stride, and he managed the latch with 2 fingers of one hand in a way that suggested considerable practice, with carrying things that required both arms, and then the warmth of the interior hit her like something physical. A wall of cedar-scented heat from the iron stove in the corner that had been burning for hours and had turned the small room into something that felt to Hannah's freezing, depleted body like the most extravagant luxury she had ever encountered. He set her down on the low bench near the stove with the same unhurried care with which he had picked her up, and then he was moving around the cabin with a quiet efficiency she tracked through half-closed eyes, pulling a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the narrow bed, filling the kettle from the water barrel, adding wood to the stove, with the practiced motions of a man who has performed this sequence so many times it requires no conscious thought. He draped the blanket around her shoulders without ceremony, the way you might settle a saddle over a horse's back, practical and sure. And then he crouched in front of her and looked at her hands. She had forgotten about her hands. She looked down at them now in the stove light and found them an unpleasant color, the knuckles split and roe, the cut on her left palm dried brown and slightly deeper than she had registered in the meadow. Her fingers were white at the tips in a way that made the back of her neck tighten with recognition of how close she had come to something she did not want to name directly. He took her hands in both of his without asking, turned them palm up, and examined them with the focused attention of a man doing an accounting. His hands were very warm. She felt the heat of them against her cold fingers as a kind of mild shock to her nervous system, and she had to make a deliberate effort not to pull away from the unfamiliarity of it, the reflex toward apology and self-sufficiency that had been wired into her for so long it operated mostly below the level of conscious thought. "Not frostbitten," he said. "Getting there, though." He set her hands carefully in her lap, rose and went to the shelf above the stove where a tin of salve sat alongside a folded strip of clean cloth. He brought both back to the bench and settled onto the stool across from her and waited, which she understood after a moment was an invitation rather than a demand. She held out her hands again. He worked on them in silence, the salve going on in careful, thorough applications that avoided unnecessary pressure on the split skin the bandage strip wrapped around her left palm with a neatness that surprised her. She watched his face while he worked. It was a weathered face, lined at the corners of the eyes and along the jaw, in the way of men who spend most of their time outdoors with a scar running from the left temple into the hairline that had the faded quality of an old story rather than a recent one. He was not by any conventional measure a handsome man in the way the word was usually applied. But there was a quality in his face that she found herself returning to something in the architecture of it that suggested everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was entirely intentional. His eyes, when they met hers briefly as he tied off the bandage, were a dark, steady gray. "Thank you," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended, scraped thin by the evening's events. He nodded once, set her hands back in her lap, and stood. The kettle had begun to make its preliminary sounds, and he moved to attend to it. "I don't know your name," she said. "Ezekiel Hayes." He said it without turning around, spooning something into 2 tin mugs with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man not accustomed to ceremony. "Hannah Carter." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the shaking in her core beginning to ease as the heat of the room reached deeper. "I have the apiary in the lower meadow." "I know," he said. She absorbed this for a moment. "You know." He turned then, carrying both mugs, and crossed the room to hand one to her before settling back onto the stool with the other. Steam rose from both in thin, fragrant columns. She wrapped her bandaged hands around the tin and discovered it was not tea, but a strong, dark broth venison, by the taste of it salted and deeply savory, and the first swallow of it went down into her empty stomach like a lit coal dropped into a cold hearth. She closed her eyes for just a second. She could not help it. When she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, which was unusual because she had become, over the course of her life, very proficient at categorizing the way men looked at her. This look did not fit any of her established categories. It was not assessment. It was not pity. It was not the particular variety of tolerant blankness she had learned to expect from men who were simply waiting for the conversation to end. It was something quieter and more persistent than any of those things, and she did not have a word for it that she felt confident about, so she let it pass unremarked and drank more of the broth. "You've been watching the apiary," she said. It was not quite an accusation. It was a statement of the thing she had just understood, delivered in a level tone that gave him room to respond with whatever degree of honesty he chose. "Your north trap line runs along the creek on that property," he said. "I check it most weeks. And the rest of the time?" The question sat in the warm air of the cabin between them. He looked into his mug, then back at her with no apparent discomfort. "You work well," he said simply, as though this explained everything, and somehow in the context of how little he appeared to say in general, it did. Hannah looked at him for a moment. Outside the cabin walls, the storm was reaching what seemed to be its full voice, a sustained howl that found every gap in the timber and tested it, and the fire in the stove answered by burning more vigorously, as fire does when it has sufficient draft, and the amber light it threw against the walls moved in slow, warm patterns that had nothing in common with the violence outside. She was stranded. That was the practical reality she needed to face. The road back to her cabin was a quarter-mile of iced hillside in pitch dark, with a storm that showed no sign of intention to relent, and she was sitting in the home of a man she had met approximately 45 minutes ago, with bandaged hands and a soaked coat, beginning to steam gently in the heat, and the particular bone-deep exhaustion that follows on the heels of genuine physical extremity. She had no options that were not foolish. She recognized this and set it against her instinctive, deeply ingrained reluctance to occupy space that was not clearly and unambiguously hers to occupy, and she said with as much plainness as she could manage, "I can't go back in this." "No," he agreed with equal plainness. "I'll need to stay until it lets up." He nodded. No hesitation, no assessment of the situation's social complexities. No elaborate negotiation of the implications. Simply a nod. As straightforward as yes, as uncomplicated, as, of course, as though the only variable that mattered was whether she was safe. And now that the answer to that was improving, the rest arranged itself without requiring much discussion. Hannah Carter could not immediately identify how to feel about that kind of uncomplicated acceptance. She had so rarely encountered it that it required a moment of quiet adjustment, the way eyes require adjustment when moving from dark to light. She looked around the cabin while the storm raged outside and the stove ticked and the broth slowly defrosted the deeper cold that had settled into her. The cabin was small and orderly in a way that spoke of a man who had thought carefully about what he needed and had made provisions for exactly that and nothing more. A narrow bed with a plain wool blanket, the iron stove, the bench she was sitting on, and the stool across from it. A table along the far wall beneath the frosted window, its surface occupied by a modest array of tools, a small hand plane, 2 carving knives in different sizes, a piece of what looked like clear-grained pine, roughly shaped toward some purpose she could not yet identify. Shelving on the south wall, carrying provisions arranged with the same orderly logic, dried beans and salt pork and a round of hard cheese and 2 tins of what appeared to be preserved peaches. A lantern hung from the central rafter beam. Pegs on the wall near the door holding a heavy coat. A coil of rope and a rifle on 2 wooden brackets, the metal of it clean and lightly oiled. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary, nothing that had not been placed there because it served a purpose. And yet the place did not feel cold or stripped bare. It felt, she thought, rather like the man himself, as far as she could determine from 45 minutes of acquaintance. Clear of pretense, reliably itself. "The hive boxes I couldn't save," she said, because the image of them was still with her, the broken wood and scattered frames the comb destroyed by ice. 13. "Frames can be built new," he said. "I know that." She heard the edge in her own voice and softened it. "I know, She stopped. What she was going to say was that it had taken her 18 months to build those 60 hives from 6 queen cells and a borrowed extractor and more summer evenings of solitary work than she could presently count, and that 13 of them were now open to the ice. And whatever survived tomorrow morning would survive not because of anything she had managed to do, but because of a man she had not known existed this morning, and she was finding the combination of loss and unexpected help difficult to process in the normal, orderly way she preferred to process things. But she did not say any of that. She said, "I'll rebuild," and drank what remained of her broth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his mug down on the floor beside the stool and reached behind him to the work table, and he picked up the piece of pine she had been unable to identify earlier. He turned it in his hands once, examining whatever progress it represented, and then he picked up one of the carving knives and he began to work. Long, careful strokes of the blade against the grain-thin curls of pale wood falling to the floor. The sound of it was extraordinarily peaceful. She did not know why she found it so. Perhaps because it was the sound of making rather than destroying, of patient intention rather than crisis, and she had had quite enough of the other kind for one evening. She listened to the fire and the knife and the storm outside, and let the warmth continue its slow work on the deep cold in her bones. And after a while she found that her shoulders had come down from somewhere near her ears, and her hands had unclenched in her lap, and she was simply sitting in the warm light of a stranger's fire, present and quiet, and not for the moment afraid of anything. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the piece of pine so she could see the emerging shape of it. A rectangular frame, slightly wider at the base, with 2 small notches cut into the ends. "Hive frame," he said. She stared at it. Then she looked at him. He was already looking back down at the wood, the knife moving again with that steady, unhurried stroke. She did not know what to say to that, and she was not the kind of woman who felt obligated to fill silence with words when she did not know what to say. So she said nothing, and he continued carving, and the storm had not lessened by an inch, but the cabin held steady around them both. The first night passed in an exhausted half-sleep for Hannah, He had given her the bed without any apparent consideration of alternative arrangements, spreading an additional blanket over the existing one, and taking the bench for himself with the philosophical equanimity of a man who has slept in worse places than a bench and knows it. She had protested briefly and without much force, because her body was overruling her social navigation at that point, and he had looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "Sleep, Miss Carter," in a tone that was not an order, but was certainly not a suggestion either, and she had been asleep before she had fully resolved her position on the matter. She woke to gray light at the window and the smell of coffee, and the sound of the storm still pressing against the walls, though with somewhat less violence than the night before, as though it had exhausted some of its primary fury in the dark hours, and was now settling into a steadier, more sustainable hostility. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself in the unfamiliar space, tracking the low sounds of the cabin's morning rhythms, and then she sat up and found Ezekiel Hayes at the stove, his back to her, moving with the same unhurried economy of motion she had observed the night before. "How long has it been raining?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "It shifted to rain about 2 hours before dawn," he said without turning. "Creek will be up. The road to your place will be mud." He poured coffee into a mug and set it on the table. "You won't get through today." She digested this. "Tomorrow depends on the rain." He turned then, leaning back against the shelf with his own mug, and looked at her with that direct, unhurried quality that she had begun cautiously to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. No agenda behind it, no calculation, just attention. "The bees will be all right until it clears," he said. "The ones that made it through the night are clustered, cold but alive." She nodded. Her throat did something involuntary at the words, "the ones that made it through," but she kept her face steady. "I owe you an apology," she said. He raised an eyebrow, very slightly. "You've been keeping a trap line on my land for however long, and I never knew you existed," she said. "I should have known my own property better." Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. "You've been busy," he said. "That's not an excuse." "Wasn't meant as one." He pushed off from the shelf and moved toward the table, and she noticed he had placed a plate of food there alongside the coffee mug. Salt pork and dense bread, and a small portion of the preserved peaches, and the plain practical generosity of it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she had not anticipated. She sat down at the table and ate, and he took the stool and drank his coffee. And outside, the rain came down in the steady, patient way of a rain that has committed to staying, and the day settled around them in a quiet that was against all reasonable expectation not uncomfortable. The second day brought a project which helped. Ezekiel had at some point during the first night or the early gray hours of that morning cut a supply of the clear pine down to hive-frame dimensions, and he produced these lengths of wood after breakfast with the simple practical air of a man identifying the next necessary task. He had a second carving knife smaller than the one he had used the night before, and he set it on the table beside the wood without comment, which was how she understood it was intended for her. She picked it up and turned one of the pine lengths in her hands, checking the grain. It was good wood properly dried, cut with an eye for the frame dimensions that she had not mentioned to him, which meant he had either significant knowledge of hive construction or had examined her hives closely enough to have measured them by sight. She looked up at him. "You know beehive dimensions," she said. "I read," he said, which was, she decided, as complete an answer as she was going to receive on the matter. They worked side by side at the table through the morning, cutting the notches and smoothing the joints, building up a small stack of completed frames that grew through the gray hours with the satisfying geometry of useful things accumulating. She found herself settling into the rhythm of it, the way she settled into the work at the apiary, that particular quality of focused absorption in which the hands know what to do and the mind can rest in the motion. He worked in the same rhythm beside her, not matching her pace exactly, but working in a parallel quiet that felt increasingly less like the proximity of a stranger and more like the easy presence of someone whose company requires no management. They talked intermittently in the way of two people who have no obligation to perform conversation and therefore only produce it when there is something worth saying. She asked him about the trap line, and he told her in his characteristically minimal way about the route he ran from the upper ridge down through the pine forest to the creek, the marten and the beaver and the occasional lynx, the way the forest moved through its seasons in this particular country. He asked her about the honey, and she found herself speaking with a fluency she rarely permitted herself in conversation, describing the harvest cycle and the particular qualities of the wildflower fields on the eastern slope and the German beekeeper's manual that she had nearly memorized over the course of 2 winters. And he listened with that complete unhurried attention that she was beginning to understand was not politeness, but genuine interest, the attention of a man who is not waiting to speak, but simply taking in what is being said. At some point in the middle of the afternoon of the second day, the rain outside showed the first tentative signs of relenting, and Hannah found herself doing a thing she had not fully expected, which was experiencing a small complicated reluctance about that. She sat with this feeling for a little while, turning the newly finished hive frame in her hands and listening to the rain thin against the window, and she thought about the cabin and the stove and the table full of good work and the quiet that had accumulated around them over 36 hours of an accidental shared life, and she thought about her own cabin wading down the iced hill in the mud, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the reluctance was real, even if she was not yet prepared to examine too closely what it meant. She was still examining it with that careful private thoroughness she brought to all things that mattered, when he rose from the table to add wood to the stove, and he paused by the window on his way back and looked out at the rain-soaked pines and the lightening sky, and he said without turning, "It'll be passable by morning." "Yes," she said. A pause. The fire settled in the stove with a soft, decisive sound. "I'll walk you down," he said. "Help assess what's salvageable." She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, and the quiet certainty of him. This man who had materialized out of a storm with no announcement and no explanation, and had simply made himself useful in every way that mattered, and she said, "You don't have to do that." He turned from the window then, and he looked at her across the small, warm room with those steady gray eyes, and he said as plainly as he said everything, "I know." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, that holds something in suspension, that asks nothing immediately, but makes clear that it is willing to wait. Hannah Carter, who had spent a significant portion of her life in silences that were cold or dismissive, or simply indifferent, recognized the difference, and felt it settle somewhere deep and previously unvisited in the architecture of her chest. She looked back down at the hive frame in her hands. Her bandaged left palm rested against the clean pine. Outside, the rain continued its slow retreat from the mountains, and the fire held steady, and somewhere in the lower meadow, 57 colony clusters of bees were riding out the last hours of the worst storm Hannah Carter had faced since coming to Pine Ridge, sustained by the warmth of their own making, waiting for morning and the promise of what came after. She set the frame down on the growing stack with the others, and she picked up the next length of pine, and she began to work again, and Ezekiel Hayes came back to the table and sat down across from her, and the carving knife moved in his hands in that steady, patient way, and neither of them said anything more that needed saying that evening, because everything that needed to be present in that room was already there. The morning came in pale and washed clean, the way mornings do after a storm has spent itself entirely, and retreated back to wherever storms come from, leaving behind a world that looks simultaneously devastated and renewed. Hannah woke before dawn on the third day in Ezekiel's cabin to the sound of genuine quiet, the kind that has texture and weight after days of wind and rain, and she lay still for a moment listening to it, the way you listen to music after a long silence, attending to each layer of it. The creek was running high and fast. Somewhere below, its voice changed from the soft murmur she knew to something deeper and more urgent. The pines dripped with a slow, steady percussion against the frozen ground. The stove had burned low in the night, and the air in the cabin had cooled to something that required the blanket, and she pulled it closer around her shoulders and looked up at the rough-hewn ceiling boards in the gray pre-dawn light and thought about her apiary. She thought about it the way you think about something you are afraid to look at directly approaching it from the edges. 47 standing hives or thereabouts. 13 destroyed. The frames she and Ezekiel had built over 2 days at the table were stacked near the door, 22 of them, good solid pine with tight joints. It was a start. It was not enough to replace everything lost, but it was a start, and Hannah Carter had learned to build things from starts. She dressed quietly in the pre-dawn, her clothing dry now and stiffened slightly from having dried too fast near the stove, and she folded the blankets on the bed with the automatic neatness of a woman who had grown up in a household where disorder was considered a moral failing. And then she stood in the center of the small, warm room and looked at the stack of frames by the door and at the man still asleep on the bench, one arm crooked under his head, his breathing deep and even, in the way of someone who has learned to sleep well in difficult circumstances, and she felt something move through her that she did not examine too closely, only noted its presence, the way you note the weather as information about current conditions. She put the coffee on before she woke him because it seemed the right thing to do. The walk down to her property in the early morning light was an accounting of damage, and Hannah made it with the set jaw and the level eyes of a woman who has learned that the only productive response to damage is clear assessment, followed by systematic action. The road was indeed mud-deep and sucking in the low places where the runoff had channeled, and she navigated it with careful steps, her boots finding the firmer ground at the edges, while Ezekiel walked beside her, carrying the stack of new frames as though they weighed nothing of consequence. The meadow, when they reached it, was waterlogged and silver in the early light. The grass pressed flat by the storm in long sweeping patterns like brushstrokes, and her hives stood in their rows against the pale sky and the dark line of the pines with the particular battered dignity of things that have been through a great deal and are still largely standing. She walked each row slowly, opening the top boards with careful hands, checking the clusters inside, listening for the low collective hum that meant life continuing under difficult circumstances. Most of the 47 were intact. The bees were cold-clustered and slow, but present and organized, the queens at the center of their tight, warm masses, the workers pressed close around them in that ancient arrangement of pure collective devotion that Hannah had always found more moving than she could adequately articulate. She pressed her ear to the side of the 14th hive in the west row and heard the hum of it vibrate through the painted wood into her cheekbone, and she closed her eyes for just a second. Alive, she said to no one in particular, or perhaps to the bees themselves. 43 surviving colonies, Ezekiel Hayes from 2 hives, over where he was completing his own quiet assessment with the same systematic approach she had been using, which she had not asked him to apply, and which she found she had no objection to whatsoever. 4 of the standing hives lost their queens in the cold. You'll need to requeen in the spring. She straightened and looked at him across the row of hives. How do you know about requeening? The corner of his mouth moved very slightly in what she had begun to identify as the Ezekiel Hayes equivalent of a broad smile. I told you, he said. I read. The rebuilding began that same morning. It was not a decision they discussed or negotiated. It simply happened in the way that necessary things happen between 2 people who are both paying attention to the same set of facts. The 13 destroyed hive boxes needed to be replaced. The frames Hannah and Ezekiel had built in the cabin were a foundation. The surviving hives needed their winter insulation wrapped properly, a task the storm had partially undone. The apiary stands needed additional bracing against the kind of weather that had just demonstrated what it was capable of. Hannah went to her cabin for tools and came back to find Ezekiel already at work on the first of the destroyed stands, pulling the damaged timber with a pry bar he had apparently brought from his own stores, stacking the salvageable wood in one pile and the lost wood in another with the automatic efficient triage of a man who wastes nothing. She pulled on her heavy gloves and went to work beside him without preamble, and the morning moved around them in that particular rhythm she was coming to recognize as theirs, quiet and purposeful and requiring no management. Over the following 2 weeks, he came down from the ridge every day. He did not announce his arrivals or explain his departures. He simply appeared at the edge of the meadow in the late morning, sometimes carrying lumber, sometimes tools, once carrying a hand adze that proved exactly right for the shaping work on the new hive bodies, and he worked alongside her until the light went thin in the late afternoon, and then walked back up through the pines with the same quiet he had arrived with. She stopped being surprised by his presence and started being aware of it instead, which was a different thing entirely, a thing that lived lower in the body and operated at a slower frequency than surprise. They talked more during those 2 weeks than they had during the storm. Not at length, not in the long, discursive way of people who are filling silence with the sound of themselves, but in the gradual, cumulative way of two people who are learning each other, one honest exchange at a time. She told him about the German beekeeper's manual, and he told her about the survey maps he had made of the upper ridge country in his years before the mountains. She told him about her first harvest season, the moment she had first tasted Pine Ridge honey, and understood that the land was giving her something exceptional. And he told her about the first winter he had spent alone up here, the mistakes he had made, and the things he had learned from them, speaking about it with a matter-of-fact candor that she recognized as the specific kind of honesty available only to people who have stopped performing strength and started simply having it. She learned in pieces some portion of who he was, not all of it. She had the sense that all of it was a long way down, accessible only through extended and patient excavation, and she was not in a position to undertake that work yet, nor was she certain she had been invited to, but pieces. He had served in the war, though he did not specify which engagement or in what capacity, and she did not press reading in the set of his face when the subject approached that there were rooms in that particular house he was not yet opening to visitors. He had come to the ridge country afterward in the way of a man who needed the silence of large spaces and had the self-knowledge to provide it for himself. He had been here 4 years. He did not appear to miss the world he had come from, a sentiment she recognized with considerable personal familiarity. He had a precision about him that she found increasingly admirable, a quality that extended from the way he cut wood to the way he spoke to the way he regarded things, an unwillingness to be approximate about anything that mattered. She had grown up surrounded by approximation by the social language of her mother's world, where things were constantly being softened and hedged and reframed to be more palatable, where truth was a raw material to be refined into something presentable before delivery. Ezekiel Hayes appeared to have no interest in that process. He said what was accurate, and he left the rest alone. And she found herself in his company saying more accurate things herself and less of the other kind. It was on a Thursday in the 3rd week after the storm, with most of the rebuilding done and the apiary standing stronger and more comprehensively braced than it had been before the ice came, that the incident happened, which she would later identify as the pivot point of that season, the moment around which everything before and after arranged itself. They had been working since mid-morning on the last of the new hive bodies, fitting the bottom boards and the entrance reducers in preparation for the coming hard winter. The afternoon had warmed slightly enough to make the work comfortable, and they had settled into the easy lateral quiet of two people engaged in satisfying labor on a fine November day. Hannah was crouched at the near end of the row, fitting the last entrance reducer into place, and she had been conscious for some time of a slight awkwardness in her movements, the way she kept pulling her coat closed across her front when she straightened, the way she had angled herself away from him when reaching for the tool basket, the small unconscious choreography of a woman who has been trained by long experience to minimize the physical fact of herself in the presence of other people. She was not always aware of doing it. That was the truest and most painful thing about it, that it had been practiced so long and so thoroughly that it had moved below the level of intention into the level of reflex, a constant invisible tax her body paid without being asked. But today she had caught herself at it twice in the span of an hour, and the catching of it had produced the particular variety of shame that comes not from being observed in something embarrassing, but from observing it in yourself, from seeing clearly the way that other people's cruelty has become your own internal voice. She straightened from the hive and pushed the hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, and she made the mistake of catching her own reflection in the dark, still water pooled in a low spot of the meadow from the receded storm, and she saw what she always saw, what she had always been told to see, and something in her chest went small and cold. She said it before she could stop herself, not loudly, barely more than under her breath, but in the way of something that has been held in pressure for a long time and finds a momentary gap in the containment. I am taking up half the meadow just standing here. She had not intended him to hear it. She did not think she had said it loud enough to carry. But Ezekiel Hayes had very good ears, and he had been attuned to the frequency of her voice for weeks in the way of a man who has been paying close attention, and he heard it. He set down the wooden mallet he had been using. He did not set it down with any drama or emphasis. He simply placed it on the hive stand with careful hands in the way he placed all things, and he straightened to his full height and turned to look at her, and the quality of his attention shifted into something she had not seen from him before, something with both weight and warmth in it, and she felt the change of it, even before he spoke. He crossed the few yards between them in his unhurried way, and he reached past her to the small camp table set up at the end of the row where the afternoon provisions sat, and he poured a mug of tea from the tin pot that had been keeping warm on the portable brazier she kept out here in the cold months, and he turned and held it out to her, and she took it. And he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and he said, "What are you apologizing for, Hannah?" It was not quite a question. It was a statement shaped like a question, the kind that is not actually asking for information, but is instead asking for attention to be paid for a thing to be seen clearly. She opened her mouth to deflect it, to say nothing, to redirect toward the work remaining, to do any of the 27 things she had learned to do with uncomfortable moments. He waited. He was extraordinarily patient, this man. He had a patience that was not passive, not the patience of someone simply tolerating delay, but active and warm, the patience of someone who is genuinely willing to give you the time you need, because he believes what you might say with that time is worth waiting for. She closed her mouth. She looked down at the tea in her bandaged hands. The steam came up from it in a slow curl. He did not fill the silence. He simply stood there, a foot and a half away from her in the cold November air, with the pine trees and the hum of 43 colonies behind them, and he waited with all of himself, and she felt the waiting as something she could rest a small part of her weight against, without it giving way. "The men in the cities worship corseted skeletons," he said, and his voice was low and even and entirely without performance, the voice of a man saying the most accurate thing he knows, but bones can't keep a man warm. She looked up at him. He met her eyes with that direct, unhurried attention, and he said, "When I look at you, I see a hearth fire. I see a home." The meadow was very still around them. A bird somewhere in the pines said one thing and then stopped. The afternoon light lay across the hive rows in long amber columns that turned the painted white boxes to cream and gold, and the bees, 43 colonies of them, murmured their low, continuous note into the cold air, and Hannah Carter stood in the center of all of it and felt something in her chest that she had kept carefully locked for a very long time. Something she had decided a long while back was probably not hers to have turned over slowly and quietly like a stone turned toward the light. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to weep. She was not a woman who wept easily, and she had not been brought this far by the simple expedient of falling apart at the first warmth she encountered. But her eyes were bright, and her hands had tightened around the tin mug, and she was looking at him with an expression she was aware she was not fully controlling, and he was looking back at her with that same expression she had never been able to categorize, the one that was not assessment or pity or tolerant blankness, but something older and quieter and more permanent than any of those things. "That is," she said, and stopped and tried again, and said, "No one has ever said anything like that to me." Then they weren't paying attention. He said simply as though this were a factual matter rather than the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever offered her. She laughed unexpectedly and not prettily, a short, involuntary sound that surprised her considerably, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that she suddenly, with the clarity of a thing seen for the first time, after being looked past for a long time, understood perfectly. She had a name for it now. It was the face of a man who has been careful with something valuable and is discovering that the care was warranted. They stood for a moment in the cold light, with the enormity of the small thing that had just passed between them, settling around them both, and then, because they were both people who returned to work when the available words had been used, and the silence required something purposeful, they turned back to the last of the hive bodies. But the air between them was different now, carrying a new register, something that moved at a frequency below speech and above ordinary proximity, something that required no management because it was entirely itself. He came back the next day and the day after that, not only for the work which was largely complete, but in the way of someone who has found a place that fits the shape of him in some specific way and is not inclined to leave it unnecessarily. He began taking his noon meal with her at the small table in her cabin, a development that began with her handing him coffee one afternoon and extended itself naturally and without formal negotiation into a daily arrangement. She cooked well with the same no-nonsense thoroughness she brought to everything. And he ate with a focused appreciation. She found she valued not the elaborate compliments she had sometimes endured at her family's table, where food was always partly a social performance, but the simple, attentive pleasure of a man eating something good and knowing it. She learned more of him at that table, not all at once, not through direct excavation. The way you learn a landscape by spending time in it in different lights and different weathers until you begin to know where the solid ground is and where the soft places are. She learned that he read widely and remembered everything that his mind moved with the same quiet precision as his hands. That he had a dry, occasional humor so understated that it sometimes arrived several seconds before she recognized it as humor, at which point she would look up from whatever she was doing and find the faint, satisfied look in his eyes of a man who was accustomed to waiting for the delayed response. She learned that he was lonely in the way of someone who has chosen solitude for good reasons and is not sorry for the choice, but is not, after all, made entirely of stone. She recognized that particular variety of loneliness because it was hers as well. The loneliness not of isolation, but of connection withheld of a full interior life that has had no appropriate recipient of things worth saying that have accumulated in the silence, because there has been no one worth saying them to. The days grew shorter, and the cold deepened toward the full weight of mountain winter, and the apiary was whole again, stronger than it had been 60 hives standing in their rows with the clean new wood of the rebuilt boxes, bright against the older weathered frames, the bees clustered deep inside against the cold and the coming months. Hannah had taken inventory and done her accounting and found that despite the storm losses, she was positioned well for the spring, better than well, because the honey stored and already contracted to Mr. Whitmore at the general store represented more income than she had projected for the entire season. And the new frames she and Ezekiel had built would start her spring colonies with fresh, clean comb that would make the first spring harvest cleaner and more abundant than it might otherwise have been. She did not tell him about the accounting in numerical terms because he had not asked, but she told him that the season had been overall a success one afternoon while they sat on the 2 chairs she had placed outside her cabin door in a brief, pale spell of November sun, drinking coffee and watching a hawk make long, lazy circles above the eastern meadow. "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Mr. Whitmore mentioned it to Jarvis at the feed store," he said. "Jarvis mentioned it to me." She turned to look at him. "You go into town?" "Occasionally, and people mention my business to you." The corner of his mouth moved. "You are something of a topic in Pine Ridge, Hannah. The woman who built an apiary on 12 rocky acres and produces the finest honey anyone here has tasted. People are curious." She considered this. It was she recognized an entirely different kind of attention than the attention she had grown up under. Not the assessing, categorizing attention of a society that was trying to determine what to do with her, but the respectful, interested attention of a community watching competence build something real. She was not entirely sure how to receive it, but she found she was not as resistant to it as she might have expected. "And you," she said carefully, "what do you tell them when they mention my business to you?" He looked out at the hawk for a moment. "That you know what you're doing," he said, "that the land is lucky to have you on it." She was quiet for a while after that, drinking her coffee and watching the hawk and turning the words over in the private space behind her ribs where she kept the things that mattered. The land is lucky to have you on it. Not you are lucky to have the land. Not the land could be made profitable with the right management. The land is lucky. As though she were the gift in the arrangement rather than the recipient of it. As though her presence on these 12 rocky acres were itself a form of abundance. She thought about her mother's house and Gerald Whitfield's ledger book assessment of her, and she thought about the cold, diminishing years she had spent being sorted into the liability column of other people's accounts, and she thought about 60 hives of bees humming in the lower meadow, and 22 hand-carved frames stacked by a cabin door, and a man who had walked out of a storm and said she looked like a hearth fire. She did not cry. She drank her coffee. But she let the warmth of it settle into the deep place where the cold had been for a very long time, and she felt with a quiet certainty that she recognized as a different order of knowing from anything she had experienced before that Pine Ridge was not where she had ended up. It was where she had arrived. The distinction was everything. The hawk made one final circle and then dropped into the pines with the sudden committed decisiveness of something that has found what it was looking for, and the sky above the meadow was very blue and very cold and entirely clear, and Ezekiel Hayes sat beside her in the pale November sun and said nothing more that needed saying because he had already said the thing that mattered, and it was still working on her, and he was above all things patient enough to let it. Winter came to Pine Ridge with the particular authority of mountain winters, unhurried and absolute, laying its white silence over the meadows and the pine slopes and the frozen creek with the certainty of something that has done this many times before and expects no argument. The apiary stood under the snow in its neat rows, 60 hives sealed and insulated, and waiting the colonies inside burning their winter stores in the dark with the patient metabolic faith of creatures that have always known spring would come even in the depths of January when there was no particular evidence to support that belief. Hannah checked them on the warmest days, pressing her ear to each painted side in turn and listening for the hum, that deep and steady note that meant everything essential was continuing as it should. She had developed by December a relationship with the winter that she had not expected and would not have predicted from the vantage of her first season in Pine Ridge, when the cold had been primarily an adversary to be endured. Now she found it had a quality she valued, the enforced slowness of it. The way it reduced everything to its necessary core, stripped away the busy surface of the productive months, and left only what was fundamental: fire and food and warmth and the things worth sitting still with. She had her books, the Beekeeper's Manual, and a small collection of others she had accumulated from the subscription library service that came through Pine Ridge twice a year by wagon. She had her accounts to keep, and her spring plans to make the expansion she had been considering since midsummer, a second set of hives on the eastern slope where the late-blooming aster fields would extend the honey season by 3 weeks if she positioned them correctly. And she had Ezekiel Hayes, who came down from the ridge 3 or 4 times each week through the winter months, with the reputable, unhurried frequentant of the seasons themselves, arriving at her door in the gray morning or the cold afternoon with firewood he had cut on her property, or a brace of rabbits from the upper trapline, or sometimes nothing more than himself, which she had come to understand was its own sufficient offering. What grew between them through that winter was not the rapid consuming thing that the novels in her small library described when they described love, all sudden recognitions and breathless declarations, and the swift resolution of uncertainty into certainty. It was slower and more substantial than that. It was built from accumulated specifics, from the particular way he stacked her firewood, so that the largest pieces were accessible first from the way she always had coffee ready when he arrived, without it ever having been discussed, from the long evenings by her stove, where they read in companionable silence, or talked in the careful, honest way they had developed from the way he had learned, without being told the precise distance she needed between herself and any suggestion of being managed, and from the way she had learned without being told the precise shape of the silence around his war years and how to move around it without pressing on it. They did not speak about what they were to each other directly, not through those winter months. It was present between them with a steady, warm constancy that required no verbal architecture, the way a fire requires no explanation for the warmth it generates. She was aware of it. She was fairly certain he was aware of it, and they were both by temperament and by the particular educations their respective histories had provided people who moved carefully toward things that mattered. By March, the subscription library wagon brought Hannah a catalog from a commercial beekeeper's supplier in the Eastern Territories, and she spent an evening with it at her kitchen table, marking what she would need for the spring expansion, with a pencil, and Ezekiel sat across from her reading a surveyor's almanac he had brought from the ridge, and at some point she looked up and found him watching her with that expression she now had a name for, and she said, without planning to, "I'm going to need help building the new stands on the eastern slope." He looked at the catalog in front of her and then back at her face. "How many new hives?" 20 to start, 40 if the first season goes well." He was quiet for a moment, which with him was never empty, but was always thinking. "The slope gets morning sun and afternoon shade," he said. "The aster fields are most active in the afternoon heat. You'll want the entrances facing south-southeast." She looked at him. "You've been up to the eastern slope." "Trap line runs past it." The corner of his mouth. "I may have given it some consideration." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said carefully, "You give a great deal of consideration to things concerning my property." He met her eyes. "I do," he said with the complete uncomplicated honesty that was she had come to understand the fundamental currency of his character. "I expect I always will." There was nothing she could say to that which would have been as sufficient as the silence that followed it, so she let the silence stand, and they both returned to their reading, and the stove burned its warm red light into the winter evening, and outside the snow lay over Pine Ridge in its white patient covering, and somewhere in the lower meadow 60 colonies waited for the turning of the season that was already in its molecular and invisible way already in motion. Spring came as it always comes, as though it had never been away, as though winter were the interruption rather than the alternative. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, first revealing the dark, saturated earth beneath, and the first green appeared in the low meadow within a week of the equinox. Tentative and brilliant, and 3 days after the first green. Hannah saw the first scout bees from the near hive spiraling up into the pale March air and felt the particular gladness of it move through her chest like a bell note. She and Ezekiel began work on the eastern slope stands the last week of March on days when the ground was sufficiently thawed to receive the post footings. He had surveyed the slope the previous week with a thoroughness that produced a hand-drawn map of the proposed layout that she had studied for 20 minutes at her kitchen table, noting the south-southeast orientation of every entrance, the drainage considerations, the proximity to the aster fields, and she had looked up from the map at him and said, "This is exactly right." And he had accepted that with a brief nod that nonetheless carried a quality she had learned to recognize as something close to pleasure in him. The spring honey season opened in May, with a warmth that was almost extravagant after the long winter, and by June, Hannah had 40 new hives operating on the eastern slope, in addition to the 60 in the lower meadow, and the bees worked the wildflower fields and the aster slopes, and the late clover, with an industry that was to her experienced eye exceptional. She extracted the first eastern slope harvest in late July and tasted it and stood very still for a moment in her kitchen with the honey spoon at her lips, because the honey from the aster-heavy eastern fields had a character distinctly different from the wildflower honey of the lower meadow, lighter in color and sharper in flavor. With a floral note she had no precise name for, and she understood immediately that she had 2 separate products of genuine quality, and that the combination of them would be something she could take to markets well beyond Mr. Whitmore's general store. She had been right. By August she had received 3 inquiries from merchants in the larger territory towns, based on samples Mr. Whitmore had circulated through the regional traders' network, and by September she had signed 2 supply agreements that represented, when she sat down with her accounts ledger and worked through the numbers carefully, more income than she had earned in both previous seasons combined. She sat with the ledger open before her and looked at the numbers for a long time, not with the giddy, unstable feeling of sudden windfall, but with the deep, solid satisfaction of someone watching the proof of a long and carefully tended effort arrive in its proper form. It was the kind of success that did not announce itself loudly. It settled quietly into the accounts, and the strengthened hive rows, and the 2 signed supply agreements in the box under her bed, and she carried it in the same way she carried most things of genuine value inwardly without display, understanding that the things most worth having rarely require an audience. The success, however quiet she kept, it was not entirely without an audience. Pine Ridge was a small community, and small communities have excellent information networks operating through the general store and the feed store and the twice-weekly mail wagon and the particular social institution of neighbors talking over fences and across property lines. By late September, the fact of Hannah Carter's expanding apiary business and her newly signed merchant contracts had circulated through Pine Ridge with the efficient thoroughness that important local news always achieves in such places. And Pine Ridge was not the only place with excellent information networks. She found the letter on the first Tuesday of October, wedged in among the mail she collected from the general store on her weekly trip to town. She recognized the handwriting on the outside of it before she had fully registered that she was reading it, the tight, forward-leaning script of a man who had learned to write in a school that emphasized efficiency over elegance. The G's and the W's formed with a particular compressed deliberateness that she had seen on household accounts and legal documents throughout the years she had spent in her family's home. She stood outside the general store in the October wind with the letter in her hand and felt the cold of it travel up her arms and settle in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The letter was from Gerald Whitfield. She did not open it in town. She put it in her coat pocket and drove home with her other supplies and her weekly provisions, and she set it on the kitchen table, and looked at it while the coffee came to heat on the stove, and then she opened it and she read it, with the controlled level attention she had learned to apply to things that required her to be larger than her instinctive response. It was, in its external form, a cordial letter. Gerald Whitfield had always been precise about the forms of things, which was one of the qualities that had made him particularly effective at a certain variety of cruelty. He inquired after her health with a specific pointed warmth that Hannah recognized as the kind deployed by people who want you to believe they have always wished you well. He expressed in terms that managed to be both vague and pointed simultaneously that word of her enterprise had reached the family, and that they were delighted, simply delighted, to hear that she had found her footing so admirably. He expressed further that Cecilia thought of her often and would so love to reconnect, which Hannah noted was a message purportedly from Cecilia, but written by Gerald Whitfield in Gerald Whitfield's handwriting, and which she therefore assigned its appropriate weight. And then in the fourth paragraph, with the same smooth transition of a man accustomed to sliding the primary point in among the pleasantries like a blade between ribs, he expressed that as her nearest family, they had been giving some thought to her situation, and that given the quite extraordinary development of her little venture, Gerald was prepared to invest his own considerable business acumen and connections in the Carter name's benefit, and that perhaps, at her convenience, he might come to Pine Ridge to discuss the matter in person and review the relevant property arrangements. She set the letter down on the table and picked up her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the meadow and her hives in their rows and the eastern slope beyond with the newsstands barely visible through the turning trees. And she felt something move through her that was cold and specific and recognizable. The ghost of an old fear that had lost much of its power over her, but had not, she found, lost it entirely. She had half expected something of this kind. Not necessarily from Gerald Whitfield in particular, not necessarily in October of this particular year, but something of this nature had been a theoretical presence in her accounting since the first merchant agreement, the way a prudent person accounts for bad weather, even in a good season. The success had been too visible to remain unnoticed by people who had written her off, and people who had written someone off have a particular talent for reappearing with interest once that someone proves the writing off to have been premature. What she had not fully accounted for was the specific quality of dread that came with seeing that handwriting the way it reached past her present self and found the younger one who had spent years under that man's systematic, smiling diminishment, and briefly convinced her that his assessment of her situation was still the relevant one. She told Ezekiel about the letter that afternoon when he came down from the ridge. She did not perform distress about it because she was not primarily distressed. She was clear-eyed and cautious and doing her accounting with the specificity the situation required. She read him the relevant portions, and he listened without interruption and without any visible change in his expression, though she had learned to read the less visible changes, the slight stillness that came over him when he was attending to something he considered serious. The quality of his silence, which became in those moments distinctly denser. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter on the table. "Are the property deeds in order?" he said. "Entirely," she said. "The land agent's records in town, my own copies in the deed box, and a set lodged with the county recorder in the spring when I filed the business registration." He nodded. "Does he have any legal standing to any part of this property?" "None. The land was purchased with my own funds from my own inheritance. My father's estate was entirely resolved before my departure. There is no encumbrance of any kind." "Then the letter is noise," he said. She looked at him. "Noise can be a prelude to something louder," she said. He met her eyes. "If it becomes something louder," he said with a quiet and absolute certainty, "it won't find what it's looking for here." She held his gaze for a moment and felt the steadiness of him settle against the cold the letter had put in her chest, and she felt the cold recede, not entirely, not immediately, but measurably. She folded the letter and put it back in its envelope, and placed it in the deed box with the property documents, which was both a practical choice and a deliberate one, placing the threat in proximity to all the evidence of its powerlessness. Gerald Whitfield arrived on the second Thursday of October, and his arrival in Pine Ridge had precisely the quality she had anticipated and feared, which was the quality of a man who has dressed a predatory intention in a presentable suit and is relying on the suit to do most of the work. He came in a hired coach, which was itself a statement, because the road to Pine Ridge did not naturally suggest hired coaches, and the deliberate choice of one over the more practical alternatives said something about the kind of impression Gerald Whitfield had come to make. He was a tall man, handsome in the smooth, well-maintained way of men whose handsomeness has been carefully invested over many years with the easy, assured manner of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival. He found Hannah at her cabins in the late morning examining her autumn honey stores, and he came up the path with a broad, warm smile that reached precisely as far as his eyes and not 1 inch further. "Hannah," he said, as though they had parted on the best possible terms, and no revision of that understanding was required. "You look remarkably well." And she set down the jar she had been holding and looked at him with the level, direct gaze she had developed over 2 years of living in a place that rewarded honesty and punished evasion. "Gerald," she said, "you've come a long way." He spent the first 20 minutes performing. She recognized the performance because she had watched it many times from close proximity throughout the years when she had been required to share a household with him, the specific theater of Gerald Whitfield positioning himself as a man of generous intentions and considerable resources who was proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement out of the goodness of his family feeling. He admired the apiary with the particular kind of admiring that is actually assessing. He praised her industry with the particular kind of praising that is actually expressing surprise. He spoke of family of the Carter name, of shared interests, and the wisdom of consolidating strengths, all in the warm, frictionless language of a man who has had considerable practice making unreasonable things sound self-evident. And then he arrived at the point as she had known he would, and the point was this. He proposed to relieve her of the burdens of sole proprietorship, to bring the financial and legal infrastructure of the Whitfield commercial interests to bear on what he called her charming little venture, and to do so by means of a partnership arrangement that would require as its foundational document a transfer of the property deed into joint Whitfield-Carter ownership. He said it smoothly. He said it with every appearance of offering her something valuable. He said it with the implicit suggestion woven through every carefully chosen word that she would be foolish to decline. Hannah listened to all of it. She did not interrupt, which had always confused people who expected her to be flustered or overwhelmed. She simply listened with the complete unhurried attention she had learned from Ezekiel, the attention that takes everything in, and gives back only what is measured and intentional. And when he finished, she said, "No." He paused. The warm smile held its position by apparent act of will. "I understand it's a considerable decision," he said. "I'd encourage you not to respond immediately without giving it proper consideration." "I've given it proper consideration," she said. "Since October 1st, when your letter arrived." "The answer is no." The smile adjusted itself, recalibrating towards something more direct. "Hannah, be reasonable. You're running a complex commercial operation alone on a remote property without legal protection or business infrastructure. The risks are considerable. The risks are mine to assess," she said, "and I have assessed them." Something shifted in his face, then a subtle rearrangement of the features as the performance dropped a register towards something less managed. "You're being sentimental," he said. "I understand that you're proud of what you've built here. That's natural. But pride is not a business strategy, and sentiment is not a legal framework. You need the support of your family." "I needed the support of my family for 28 years, she said with a steadiness in her voice that surprised even her. It was not significantly available. I found I could manage without it." His eyes went cool. She had seen this before the precise moment when Gerald Whitfield's patient management of a situation gave way to its underlying mechanism. "You're being naive," he said. "Do you honestly think you can sustain this alone indefinitely in this remote wilderness? And what about this mountain man I've been hearing about? This Hayes. Do you genuinely believe a man like that has any interest in you beyond what you've built here? Look at yourself, Hannah. Be honest with yourself for once. He's found a capable woman on a valuable piece of land. Men like that don't want what you seem to believe they want." The words landed the way he had intended them to land. She felt each one make contact with the exact point it was aimed at, the deep, long-established wound, the architecture of doubt that had been built over years of precisely this kind of assault patient and strategic and dressed in the language of concern. She felt the old cold come back into her chest. She felt the old voice, the one that sounded like her mother's drawing room and Gerald Whitfield's ledger book, and the cool assessment of a dozen social events where she had been found insufficient, begin to speak. She let it speak. She had learned in 2 years of solitude and honest self-examination and 60 hives of bees that responded only to what was genuine, that the way to deal with that voice was not to fight it directly, but to let it say its piece, and then hold it up against the available evidence and see which one was more credible. The available evidence was as follows. Ezekiel Hayes had walked out of a storm to carry her to safety when he could have stayed warm in his cabin. He had built hive frames in the night for a woman he barely knew. He had come down from the ridge every day for 2 weeks to help her rebuild something that was not his. He had told her she looked like a hearth fire, and said it the way he said everything accurate with no ornamentation and no intention beyond the truth of it. He had surveyed her eastern slope without being asked because he had been thinking about her future. He had asked whether her property deeds were in order before he had asked anything else. She held the old voice's case against the evidence. The evidence won not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, solid certainty of a thing that has been tested and has held. She lifted her chin. She met Gerald Whitfield's cool eyes with her own, and they were not cold her eyes, but they were steady, and they were clear, and they did not look away. "I think," she said, "that you should leave now, Gerald." His face went hard. The performance was entirely gone. "You're making a significant mistake," he said. "I came here out of genuine concern for your situation, and you're treating me like an adversary." "You came here for the land," she said. "I have reviewed my situation carefully, and I am not in need of assistance. The property is mine fully and entirely, and it will remain so. I would like you to leave." He looked at her for a long moment, doing his accounting, assessing whether there was a remaining angle of approach that had not been closed. She watched him do it with a detached clarity that surprised her. She could see the calculation in his face, the way you can see the machinery of a clock through a glass face, all the moving parts visible and predictable, and she felt, with a deepening of the quiet satisfaction she had been building in herself for 2 years, that she was not afraid of any of those parts. Then he said, "This isn't finished," and there was something under the smooth certainty of it that she had not heard in his voice before, something with an edge of threat rather than persuasion, and she felt the quality of the afternoon change. And then, from somewhere behind and to her left, from the direction of the meadow path that came up along the east side of the property, there was the sound of unhurried footsteps on the frozen ground, and Gerald Whitfield's eyes moved past her shoulder, and something in his face underwent an involuntary recalibration. She did not need to turn around to know who was there. She could feel the particular quality of his presence, the way the air organized itself differently when he was in it, the way the space at her back became in an instant something solid and warm and permanent. Ezekiel Hayes had come down from the ridge. He came up the path with the rifle across his shoulder, in the casual, unhurried way of a man who has carried a rifle so long it has become simply an extension of himself, neither display nor threat in its resting position, only presence. He was wearing his heavy coat against the October cold, and his hat was pulled low against the sharp afternoon wind coming down through the pass, and he walked with that particular quality of motion she had come to know as entirely his, the motion of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to adjust his pace for anyone's observation of the fact. He came to stand at Hannah's left shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, and he looked at Gerald Whitfield with those steady gray eyes and said nothing at all, which was, she had learned frequently, more effective than anything that could be said. Gerald Whitfield looked back at him with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had believed he had fully mapped. He had clearly heard about Ezekiel Hayes through whatever network had brought him the news of Hannah's success, and what he had heard had perhaps suggested someone more easily managed than what was currently standing 12 feet away from him, regarding him with the patient, absolute stillness of a man who has nothing to prove and no performance to maintain. "Hayes," Gerald said with the careful tone of a man deciding how to position himself. He had clearly been told the name. "I've heard you've been helpful to my sister-in-law. That's admirable." He paused, letting the next part arrive with all the casualness of something entirely incidental. "Family is grateful for community support, of course. Hannah has had a difficult time of it managing all this alone. It's a great deal for one person." Ezekiel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Hannah. She met his eyes, and she saw in them the question, not a demanding question, not an instructing one, but the genuine and respectful question of a man who understands that this is her ground to stand on and is asking whether she needs anything from him, and the simple, complete dignity of being asked rather than being rescued moved through her with a warmth she felt in her hands and her throat and the deep center of her chest. She turned back to Gerald Whitfield. She had already said what needed to be said. She had said no, and she had said leave, and she had said the property was hers and would remain so. But she had not said all of it, yet she recognized. There was a remainder still owing a final accounting that had been building since a garden party overheard remark when she was 17 years old, since a three-quarters closed door, and her mother's voice describing her as a difficult proposition since 28 years of a family that had held her at arm's length and called it love, since a letter that arrived with cordial handwriting and a blade in the 4th paragraph. She did not raise her voice. She did not require volume for what she was about to say, because the things most worth saying do not require it. "I want you to hear me clearly, Gerald," she said, "not because I believe you will be changed by it, because I have sufficient experience of your character to know that your understanding of other people functions primarily as a tool rather than an interest, but because I require for my own purposes to say it plainly and to have it plainly heard." He watched her with the contained, calculating look of a man waiting for a weak point to appear. "This land is mine," she said, "purchased with my own funds, cultivated by my own hands, built into a productive enterprise by my own labor and my own knowledge over 2 years, during which no member of my family offered any assistance or expressed any interest. The property deeds are registered with the county recorder in my name alone, without encumbrance or competing claim of any kind. You have no legal standing here, and no moral claim, and I would ask any reasonable court in this territory to agree with me on both counts, and I am confident they would." Gerald's jaw had tightened slightly. The smooth presentation had fully resolved into something harder and plainer. "Beyond the legal facts," she continued, "I want to address what you said about Mr. Hayes. You suggested that his interest in me is material rather than genuine. You suggested that I am naive to believe otherwise. You deployed that suggestion in the specific way you have always deployed your assessments of me, as a weapon aimed at the place where you calculated I would be least defended." She paused. Somewhere in the meadow behind her, a late-season bee hummed past in the cold air, brief and purposeful, and she felt it as a small endorsement. "I have spent considerable time in the company of a man who has asked nothing from me that was not freely given, who has offered everything he offered without calculation or condition, and who has treated me, in each small daily particular of his conduct, as someone whose presence in the world is a matter of value rather than inconvenience. I am not naive, Gerald. I am, in fact, the most clear-eyed I have ever been in my life. And what I see when I assess my situation with that clarity is a piece of land that is entirely my own, a business that is profitable and growing, and a man standing at my shoulder who has never once made me feel that the space I occupy is anything other than exactly the right amount." The October wind moved through the meadow in a long, cold sweep that bent the dry grass in a silver wave, and set the pine branches above the tree line shifting against the pale sky, and Gerald Whitfield stood in it, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, in all the years she had known him. It was the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not respond to his available tools and is processing the inconvenience of that discovery. He looked past her at Ezekiel one more time, the assessment of a man pricing an obstacle. Ezekiel looked back at him with the untroubled steadiness of a mountain and said nothing because there was nothing required from him, and he understood that precisely, and his understanding of it was itself, she thought, the most eloquent statement available. Gerald Whitfield straightened the lapels of his expensive coat. He produced from somewhere in the depleted reserves of his considerable social machinery one final version of the smooth manner, thinner now and less convincing, but present the reflex of a man who cannot easily abandon the performance even when it has demonstrably failed. "You're making a choice you may come to reconsider," he said. "I have made a great many choices in the past 2 years," she said. "I have not yet had cause to reconsider a single one." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back down the path toward the hired coach waiting at the road's end, and his footsteps on the frozen ground were the sound of something definitively finished, and Hannah Carter watched him go with the level, clear eyes of a woman who has just put down a weight she has been carrying for a very long time, and is assessing with some surprise how much lighter the air feels without it. She felt Ezekiel move to stand beside her, not behind her now, but beside her, both of them watching the retreating figure diminish down the path, and then resolve into the hired coach, and then become the sound of wheels on frozen road diminishing toward town. The sound thinned and was taken up by the wind, and then there was only the wind and the pines and the bees and the particular quality of the October afternoon light that turned everything it touched to amber, and made the world look as though it were made of the same substance as her honey. She let out a breath she had not entirely known she was holding. It came out long and slow, and took something with it that she was glad to be rid of. "You heard most of that," she said. "Enough," he said. "I didn't need you to say anything," she said, and it was not a criticism but a statement of something she wanted him to understand correctly. "I needed to say it myself." "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't." She turned to look at him then, and he was already looking at her with the expression she had named during the storm weeks, the one that was the face of a man who has been careful with something valuable, and is continuously finding that the care was warranted. The afternoon light was on his face, and it made him look less weathered and more something else, something she did not have an immediate word for, but which sat comfortably in the same region of her chest as the words hearth fire and home. "He wasn't entirely wrong about one thing," she said. Something moved in his eyes, a careful attentiveness. "I have been managing a great deal alone," she said, "since I arrived here. It has been in most respects exactly what I needed, and I do not regret a single day of it." She paused, finding the words with the precision she valued, and he understood. But I find that I have grown considerably more accustomed to not being alone than I was previously, and that this condition has come to feel less like an exception and more like a preference." The meadow hummed around them. In the honey-colored afternoon light, Ezekiel Hayes looked at Hannah Carter with everything he was all of it present and none of it withheld, and he said in a voice so quiet it was almost below the wind, "Hannah, I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, I will take it as the truth and the whole truth, and I will not revisit it for the sake of my own preference." "Ask it," she said with the same quietness. "Will you share this life with me?" he said, not dressed in elaborate language, not surrounded by the performative ceremony of a social convention. Just the plain, sufficient question of a man who has identified the most accurate thing he can say and is saying it. Not this land, not the business, this life, the particular daily fact of it, the winters and the storms and the honey seasons and the table in the evenings and the fire. I want to be the man at your side while you build everything you have not yet built. I want that to be permanent and known and mine. Hannah Carter stood in the amber October light of Pine Ridge, with 60 hives humming behind her, and 12 acres of hard-won earth under her feet, and 2 years of her own, making solid in the ground in every direction she could see, and she felt the question settle over her, the way the first warmth of spring settles over the meadow after the long winter, thorough and unhurried and entirely without condition. She thought very briefly of the 17-year-old girl sitting on the edge of a bed, turning the phrase "difficult proposition" over in her mind. She thought of the wagon loaded in the spring mud with everything she owned in the world. She thought of the storm and the freezing dark, and 2 strong hands lifting her without any suggestion that she was heavy, only the certainty that she was worth the carrying. She thought of pine frames carved in a warm cabin while the ice raged outside, and a mug of hot broth passed across a dark room, and a man who had looked at her and seen a hearth fire. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the bandaged one long since healed. Now the scarred palm warm against his, and he held it with the same careful, permanent quality he brought to everything he valued, and they stood together in the afternoon light while the bees worked their late-season rounds, and the pines leaned against the cold sky, and Pine Ridge went about its quiet, unhurried life around them. They were married in December in the small church at the center of Pine Ridge, in a ceremony attended by Mr. Whitmore from the general store, and his wife and the Jarvis family from the feed store, and 4 or 5 other families of the territory who had watched Hannah Carter build her apiary from 12 rocky acres and had concluded with the good judgment of people who respect honest work that she was worth knowing. She wore a dress she had made herself in a deep blue-green wool that suited her coloring and fit the full, strong lines of her figure, without apology or adjustment, because she had a dressmaker. Now a woman in town named Mrs. Pelham, who had looked at her the first time they met and said, "You have a wonderful figure to dress, Mrs. Hayes," and anyone who has told you otherwise has simply not understood what they were looking at. And Hannah had stood in the fitting room, feeling something both small and very large move through her at those words, and had thereafter visited Mrs. Pelham with the particular gratitude of a woman being seen correctly for the first time in a specific way. Ezekiel wore his good coat, which she had not known he owned until the week before the wedding, when it appeared hanging on the peg by his door, dark and well cut, and clearly not recently purchased a coat that spoke of a previous life he had stepped out of and not yet entirely discarded. He looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression that made Mrs. Whitmore, watching from the third pew, quietly press her handkerchief to the corner of her eye. He moved down from the Ridge cabin that month, which was not discussed but simply happened in the natural way of things that have been in the process of happening for some time. His books went on the shelf beside hers. His tools went in the workshop she had already been thinking of as partly his. The rifle went on its brackets beside her door, and she found she did not mind it. There had in fact already thought of that wall as the right place for it. The first year of their marriage was the best honey season she had yet produced. The eastern slope hives outperformed every projection she had made in the winter planning, and the combination of the lower meadow wildflower honey and the eastern slope aster honey, sold under the Pine Ridge designation she had registered with the Territory Merchants Association for a price that made the county recorder. When she filed the business year accounts, raised his eyebrows in a way that was either admiration or skepticism, and resolved when he checked the supply agreements into the former. She and Ezekiel worked the apiary together through those seasons, with the same easy parallel rhythm they had developed in the beginning, talking when there was something worth saying, and working in the good silence when there was not. And the silence between them was never empty, but was always the comfortable silence of two people who have ceased performing for each other and have settled into the genuine texture of a shared life. He had a gift for the bees that she had not anticipated, an instinctive patience with them, that they responded to the same quality she had first observed in him from a distance, that deep, unhurried attentiveness that the natural world consistently honors. Gerald Whitfield did not return. She received one further letter in the spring following his visit, a brief and notably less cordial communication from the family solicitor making a final formal inquiry regarding the property status. And she had taken it to the county seat herself and sat across the desk from the territorial land recorder and had that functionary confirm in writing that the property was entirely and unencumbered hers, and she had mailed a copy of that confirmation to the solicitor and had not heard from that direction again. The silence from her family that followed was indistinguishable from the silence that had preceded her success, which told her everything she needed to know about its nature. Cecilia wrote once a letter that was purely Cecilia's in its handwriting, and in a certain quality of genuine if shallow affection that Hannah had always believed was the true extent of what her sister had to offer. It expressed with the kind of wondering admiration that contains within it a significant quantity of incomprehension that Hannah seemed to have done extraordinarily well for herself, and that Cecilia was pleased and wished her every happiness. Hannah had read it twice, and had recognized in it the somewhat sad and somewhat sweet truth that Cecilia had loved her after a fashion throughout their lives, and had also been entirely incapable of protecting her from anything, and that both of these things were true simultaneously, and could be held together without requiring resolution into something simpler. She had written back a brief kind note that said she was well and happy, and wished Cecilia the same, and had meant it, and had then folded the correspondence away into the box beneath the bed, with all the other documents of her history, and had gone out to the meadow to check the afternoon hives. The second year of their marriage brought a winter that was long but not cruel, and a spring that arrived with a quality of softness after it that made every growing thing respond with an almost excessive enthusiasm, as though the land had been making plans through the cold months and was now implementing them without restraint. Hannah noticed early in that spring that she was tired in a way that was different from the ordinary tiredness of seasonal work, a bone-deep fatigue that had a quality of purpose to it, as though her body were engaged in a significant project and was simply requesting the appropriate resources for it. She did not say anything for 3 weeks, during which she went about her work with characteristic thoroughness, and monitored the situation with the careful, honest attention she brought to all things that mattered. At the end of those 3 weeks, she sat Ezekiel down at their kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when the fire was burning well and the spring air was coming in at the window with its new green smell, and she told him. He was very still for a moment. Not the stillness of shock, or not only that, but the stillness of a man receiving something so large that his ordinary mechanisms for processing information have briefly suspended operations in order to make sufficient room for it. She watched his face move through that stillness, and she saw what came through on the other side of it, and she felt it move through her own chest in a long, warm wave that crested and broke and left something bright and new in its wake. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he held them with the same care he brought to all valuable things. And he looked at her with eyes that were entirely unguarded in a way she had never seen them before, as though this moment had reached past every defense he had ever constructed and simply resided in the direct center of him. And he said in a voice that was the quietest she had ever heard from him, "Hannah." Just her name. Just that. But in the way he said it, which was the way he said everything that was true and essential with no ornamentation and nothing held back, it contained everything that needed to be said, and she understood it completely, and she held his hands back with an equal and answering completeness. The child was born in November, which was the month of the apiary's long settling toward winter, the month when the hives were sealed and the bees were clustered, and the meadow lay in its patient brown gold waiting for the spring that was always already on its way. Hannah had worked through most of the pregnancy with the customary thoroughness of a woman who trusts her body's considerable competence and is not given to treating normal physical process as occasions for alarm. Though she had modified certain tasks in the later months with the practical acknowledgement that some accommodations were simply sensible, and Ezekiel had made those accommodations available without commentary in the form of simply being present for anything that required a second pair of hands, which was how he had always operated and required no adjustment on his part. The birth was attended by Mrs. Halverson, the Pine Ridge midwife, a large, capable Norwegian woman who had delivered approximately half the children currently living within 20 miles of the territory's central township, and who held Hannah's hand at the critical moments with a grip that suggested she had been holding frightened women's hands for 30 years and had no intention of letting go until the matter was satisfactorily concluded. It was concluded satisfactorily on a gray November morning with the first snow of the season falling past the bedroom window in slow, soft silence in the birth of a daughter. Ezekiel was permitted into the room after the necessary interval, and he came in quietly, as he came everywhere, and he sat on the edge of the bed beside Hannah, who was exhausted in a way that was the most complete and the most satisfied she had ever been simultaneously. And he looked at the child in her arms with an expression that was entirely new on his face, that had no predecessor in any expression she had seen him wear before, and she watched him meet his daughter for the first time with the particular privilege of someone present at the arrival of something irreducibly important. He put one large, careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby's hand closed around it with the absolute instinctive trust of the newly arrived, and something in his face undid itself completely and became something else, something open and permanent and entirely without defense. And Hannah looked at the two of them and felt the fullness of it in every part of her, this life that had been built from the ground up on 12 rocky acres at the edge of the mountain territory, this life that had been declared impossible by people who had never understood what was possible, this life that was warm and real and entirely incontestably hers. The years that followed laid themselves down in the good cumulative way of years lived with intention and gratitude. The apiary grew to 120 hives across 3 locations on the property, the lower meadow and the eastern slope, and a third site Ezekiel had identified on the northern face where a late-blooming buckwheat field produced a dark, intense honey, with a flavor profile unlike anything else in the territory, which Hannah designated separately and sold to specialty merchants in the eastern cities for a price that continued to make the county recorder's eyebrows perform their small, admiring assent. The Pine Ridge designation became over those years something genuinely known in the regional market, a mark of quality that Mr. Whitmore at the general store referred to without excessive ceremony, but with evident satisfaction as the finest honey produced anywhere in the mountain territories. Their daughter, whom they named Clara after Ezekiel's mother, learned to walk in the lower meadow in the spring of her first year, moving between the hive rows with the unsteady, jubilant momentum of a child discovering locomotion, and the bees ignored her completely, which Hannah took as a form of endorsement. Clara showed from those earliest years her mother's quality of stillness around the hives, that same instinctive, unhurried calm that the bees responded to, and Hannah began teaching her the work at an age when most people would have considered it premature, but both of them understood it was not. On a September afternoon in the 3rd year after Clara's birth, Hannah was standing at the near end of the east row, checking the late-season frames, the honey glowing in the slanted afternoon light with that deep amber quality that meant the season had been good, and she felt Ezekiel come up behind her in the way she always felt him coming, not heard but sensed the particular quality of the air reorganizing around his presence, and his arms came around her from behind, crossing over the full, strong curve of her body, with the ease and completeness of a man who has found the exact place his arms belong. And she leaned back into him and felt the solid, permanent warmth of him at her back. Somewhere in the house she could hear Clara talking to the cat in the particular, serious, instructive tone she had recently adopted for all living creatures, and the afternoon was golden and still around them, and smelled of late clover and cut pine, and the faint, clean sweetness of open honey. "Good season." Ezekiel set his voice close to her ear, his chin resting on the top of her head, in the way that had become over 3 years of daily life together, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. "The best yet," she said. He held her closer for a moment, and she felt his breath against her hair, and she looked out at the rows of white hives in the amber light, and the eastern slope beyond them, rising into the blue September sky, and she thought about the wagon loaded in the spring mud, and the 6 queen cells in the flannel-wrapped box, and a woman who had been told she was too much and not enough simultaneously, and had driven out through iron gates with her spine straight and her eyes on the road. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere, not to end up, not to settle, not to make do with what was left after the things worth wanting had been distributed to other people. To arrive. To come to the place that was always yours, by the road that was exactly long enough to bring you to it. The bees hummed in their hives in the late September afternoon, 50,000 small lives organized around the certainty of warmth and sweetness and the deep, reliable order of things that have been this way since before any human being thought to name them. And Hannah Hayes stood in the meadow she had built from rocky ground and a handful of queens, and 2 years of solitary, stubborn, beautiful labor held in the arms of a man who had walked out of a storm to tell her she looked like a hearth fire. And she felt the full weight of everything she had, and everything she was settled into her bones, like the best kind of tired, like the tired that comes after a long day of exactly the right work, and she closed her eyes in the amber light and let it hold her, and it did, and it was more than enough, and it was entirely hers.